communist conspiracy is a deliberate and predictable plan of action to subvert the world. A startling story from Lenin in 1914 with 13 followers to the present with 1 billion people under the control of a comparative handful of communists. In the Soviet Union itself, only 5% of the people are members of the party. The communist philosophy that the end justifies the means has caused pain out of all proportion to the pitiful social progress communism's achieved. And yet it has spread at a fantastic speed and demonstrated a frightening vitality. Why? 2 primary reasons, I think. First, it has duped well-meaning people everywhere into thinking that it provided an answer to the economic and social problems of the world. Second, it has not hesitated to use force wherever possible to impose itself on unwilling people and to hold them in abject subjugation. What can we do in the face of this communist threat? Well, for one thing, we can, by example, let the people of the world know that the way of free men provides a surer, happier answer for their problems than the outdated, coercive doctrines of Karl Marx. That freedom, and not communism, is the doctrine of the future. War is inevitable, and it is sheer folly for us not to make every conceivable political, economic, military, and psychological preparation to win. No one knows what the end of the story will be. That's up to you.
September 28, 1991. Taking place in a large airfield in Moscow, Metallica played hit after hit from their recently released Black album to as many as 1.6 million people. The International Monsters of Rock Music Festival was posed by the international media as a freedom festival to celebrate democracy's recent victory over the failed coup attempt by Communist Party officials and usher in the democratic age of prosperity and capital. Many Western musicians such as U2, Bob Dylan, and the Rolling Stones were originally headlining what was referred to as an improbable concert, the prospect of bringing Western values such as freedom and democracy to an oppressed Eastern nation suffering under the authoritarian regime was unthinkable. This concert, for the young people who defied the tanks, included the reward of free expression in the form of rock and roll, going hand in hand, according to the Daily News, like Mick Jagger and Boris Yeltsin, the former congratulating the latter on his impressive triumph over the aforementioned last-ditch coup attempt. This ambitious event was cancelled and reorganized multiple times, finally settling on Pantera, AC/DC, Soviet metal band Electroshock Therapy, and even more metal and rock acts, culminating in the gargantuan and mind-blowing experience of Metallica, the proclaimed harbinger of Western ideals, unleashing a metallic musical barrage on an oceanic crowd, desperate for any semblance of freedom. Famously, the thousands of military and police personnel assigned to repress the concertgoers shed their uniforms and partook in the liberating act of headbanging, signifying Western heavy metal as the great unifier and liberator of communist oppression. Just a few months later, Mikhail Gorbachev officialized the collapse of the Soviet Union. Heavy metal was the final and victorious force required to knock the rotten structure of the USSR down once and for all. The inherent oppressiveness of communism, unable to contain the utter emancipatory prowess inherent to rock and roll, heavy metal, and free market capitalism. This accounting of events is, for all intents and purposes, canonical, its conclusions absolute. When one sees the massive red crowd at Moscow's Tushino airfield, one instantly considers the magnitude of oppression these people suffered to congregate in such desperate quantities, seemingly drawn by the messianic presence of Western culture, its liberty exuding forth via riffs, solos, and chants. Less frequently iterated is 1981's Monsters of Rock Festival, taking place in England, its massive crowds uninfluenced by any communist regime. 1991's Monsters of Rock tour went through Europe on its way to Moscow for its 12th and final show. Despite being last minute and its logistical prospects being laughed at by Moscow's deputy director, This project, that typically took about 6 months to set up, only took 3 weeks. This miraculous logistical prospect was introduced to Biz Enterprises director Boris Zozimov by American businessman and diplomat Tristan Dale, informing Zozimov that Time Warner wanted to give freedom and democracy-deprived Soviet youth the concert as a gift. Part of this gift was production manager Jake Berry with orders to shoot a film, For Those About to Rock, Monsters in Moscow. You may have seen footage from it. You definitely have. It's fucking playing right now. All of the decisions were made at the top, said Zozimov's assistant. Zozimov gave me a magic slip of paper from the White House on Prime Minister Ivan Silayev's letterhead, demanding full cooperation with the document's bearer in all things. The document allowed him to solve all sorts of problems, even securing lightning-fast approval of 300 entry visas for musicians, managers, and technicians. A Time Warner accountant and the site coordinator for the festival came to Moscow to supervise the construction of the stage, which rose 9 stories. Boris Zozimov brokered the passage of 24 truckloads of lighting and sound equipment through Belarus without any customs documents. I should admit that most of the work was really done by the Americans. They brought in a ton of equipment and used the Marines to build everything. They were working days and nights without sleeping. In 1991, the average calories per person per day in the USSR was at its lowest point since the end of the Second World War. The degenerated Soviet economy, crumbling due to years of illicit market reforms and crippling reactionary bureaucratic influence, in addition to the groundwork being laid for capitalist shock therapy reforms, led to a crumbling of living standards for the vast majority of Soviet citizens. Why was a concert, especially of this ridiculous scale, being prioritized over the material needs of millions of suffering people? For Time Warner, in tandem with the new Yeltsin-led Russian White House, capitalistic freedom and democracy was what the Soviet people were deprived of most, and any official cost would be met to achieve those ends. Prime Minister at the time, Ivan Silayev, is quoted saying, "The dissolution of the Soviet Union was a complex and multifaceted process. It required careful management to minimize the negative impact on the people and the economy." Apparently, part of this careful management included the prioritization of glorifying Western ideals over making bread affordable. If it's not painfully obvious by now, the moral grandstanding and dignified calls for democracy were merely a continuation of the ideological battles raging on in the late 20th century, the Cold War coming to a bitter conclusion for the people of the USSR, their consolation being a metal concert that ceaselessly exuded its attached ideological character and professed superiority. Your way of life, your culture, your history, your artistic merits and capabilities, your concept of human desire and meaning is lesser, your people's effort meaningless, your life a lie. Life is freedom, and freedom is capitalism. Only by being freed from the oppressive terror of communism can freedom be achieved. Freedom is life. Communism is anti-life. It is this ideological basis that the Cold War was fought by the US, an adherence to the intrinsic goodness of Western ideals, an absolute linkage and equivalence concocted between freedom, democracy, and market capitalism. Anti-communism itself is not merely a reaction to the USSR's threatening existence and tales of moribund abuse. Anti-communism was consciously and strenuously propagated by government leaders, business representatives, and the business-owned news media. It creates a climate of opinion and a political atmosphere that makes it easier to discredit and repress labor militancy and progressive and anti-capitalist viewpoints at home and abroad. As early as 1880, Roscoe Conkling would hail President Ulysses Grant as an eternal foe of communism, lawlessness, and disorder. Opposition to the privileged institutions of power and wealth was treated as opposition to America itself. Capitalism was called free enterprise, and equated with true Americanism, while socialism was depicted as an alien virus infecting the American body politic. The Pullman strike of 1894, in which great masses of railway workers led by Eugene Debs ceased work in protest of exploitative labor conditions, was met with headlines such as "Mobs in Control of Chicago" and "Anarchist Plot to Blow Up the Capitol." The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, in which the exploited peasants and serfs of Tsarist Russia sought liberation from the oppressive imperialist structure that led to the great slaughter of the First World War, only furthered the fears of the wealthy classes, leading to a 1919 unsuccessful campaign to overthrow the new Bolshevik government. Despite 14 wealthy imperialist nations, including the United States, invading a blood-soaked nation of peasants, the New York Times ran stories such as "Reds seek war with America" and portended imminent Bolshevik invasions. On January 2, 1920, Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer directed the Justice Department and state and local police to conduct raids in 20 cities, arresting thousands of leftists, including many trade union militants. The New York Times praised the efforts of the police and boasted, "Reds plotted countrywide strike. Arrests exceed 5,000." as well as promising these raids were only the beginning in the war against communism. In the 1920s, major American media outlets such as the fucking New York Times and Wall Street Journal ritually flooded the public with horror stories from the Soviet Union under the despicable Lenin, whilst hailed Mussolini as Italy's savior, the man who had suddenly brought his nation from poverty and unrest to harmonious prosperity, rescuing his people from the perils of anarchy and radicalism. Similar treatment was accorded to Hitler in the 30s. Both Mussolini and Hitler were attacking not the capitalist system, but its enemies. Both of them murdered leftists, imprisoned dissenters, and abolished all democratic political organizations, including opposition political parties and newspapers. They also destroyed labor unions, cut wages, reduced upper bracket income taxes, practically abolished inheritance taxes for the wealthy, subsidized big business enterprises, and privatized large portions of the public sector, thereby winning the approval of industrialists and press moguls in the US and elsewhere. You want something metal? Oh, here. The Little Steel Strike in 1937 was a result of several relatively smaller steel companies in comparison with the gargantuan US Steel, refusing to capitulate to worker demands in regards to an 8-hour workday, fairer wages, and favorable legislation. The entrepreneurial ferocity required in the hyper-competitive second tier of giant business meant a cutthroat treatment of needy labor was needed to ascend in the sphere of industry. Private and city police severely punished by way of beating, shooting, and death hundreds of striking steelworkers, including children and babies. The authorities framed the victims as marijuana-smoking communists, which included substantial black union workers, growing women in industry, and DEI deep-cut children. This is but one example of America's liberal usage of authoritarian violence committed by owners against workers, sparing not even wives and children, all for the sakes of profit. But the owners and their paid media will never leave it at that. America's authoritarian ideology is even more pervasive and inhuman. The excuse of marijuana-smoking communists is reason enough for the Washington Post in 1981 to discredit anti-war protesters, just as it was for steel companies in 1937 to kill innocent workers and children, and equally so for authorities in the Haymarket Massacre of 1886. In 1939, Progressive Senator Robert La Follette's Congressional Committee declared that business saw communism behind every move designed to improve the lot of labor. The employer cloaks his hostility to labor under the pretext that he is defending himself and the country against communism. The 1940s saw a legislature banning mass picketing, forced union workers to sign non-communist oaths, and the repeal of various hard-won pro-labor laws. The 1950s, under anti-communists Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower, were not anti-communist enough for the likes of John McCarthy. famously stoking the most intense authoritarian and draconian governmental measures against anyone and everyone even slightly suspected of communism, eventually leading McCarthy to lash out at Eisenhower himself in aims of securing a Republican presidential nomination. And only then did the political establishment consider the damage being done to the public's faith in the institutions. Anti-communism isn't even limited to pure defense. In 1950, U.S. News and World Report observed, government planners figure they have found the magic formula for almost endless economic good times. Cold War is the catalyst. Cold War is an automatic pump primer. Turn the spigot, and the public clamors for more arms spending. Turn another, the clamor ceases. Cold War demands, if fully exploited, are almost limitless. Not only is anti-communism useful for preserving your material interests and ideologically controlling a population, it is useful in procuring even greater quantities of said material in the justified forever war. The material implications of socialism, the slightest risk of cutting into the profits of owners, are ideological grounds for demonization and damnation. These material implications are obvious enough, but what basis do working class people have in defending the capitalist status quo? The splendors and abundance of market commodities ingratiate their consumers into an attachment of said splendor with the producers, and thus the system of production itself. The ideas, aspirations, and objectives that by themselves transcend the established universe of discourse and action are either repelled or reduced to the terms of this universe. Critical discussion of the qualitative substance of a word is reduced to the rationality of the given system, of which in a commodity-driven society is quantitative. Capitalism is free because of the quantity of commodities, not due to the quality of its components and attributes, of which historically have come in the form of oppressive, authoritarian, violent, and generally unfree measures. This false consciousness is immune to falsehood due to the rationality of commodity availability, the unfree procurement and allocation of resources, the unfree exploitation of labor and necessity of labor to survive, the unfree limitation of acceptable ideology and economic structuring, the unfree treatment of various subjugated populations. None of this is considered not free when the universe of dialogue presupposes freedom in its capitalistically rational form, one that defines freedom in terms of how much shit you can buy. This contradiction is just one of the many lining the halls of capitalism's magnificence. The ceaseless quest for infinite profit growth is doomed to existence on a finite planet and cursed with burdensome fixed capital expenses. The free market is prone to limitations on trade and represses alternatives. The class structure of owners seeking to get the maximum profits out of labor while expending as little as possible on wages is met with labor seeking to do the least amount of work possible for the most pay possible. The limitless expansion and hedonistic abundance of neoliberalism greets a conservative reaction, unsettled by this impersonal, all-consuming void, with the desire to retain normalcy and comfort in the very same abundance-promoting hedonism. Our greatest enemies and ideological adversaries are touted as ever-increasing in influence and power, while simultaneously regarded as backwards, incompetent, and their efforts futile. These contradictions lend to ideological manipulation in what Mark Fisher in his book Capitalist Realism referred to as reflexive impotence. We know that things are bad, but more than that, we know we can't do anything about it. But that knowledge, that reflexivity, is not a passive observation of an already existing state of affairs. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. This entrapment to the reality of capital is not only a capitulation to a reality of contradiction, but capitulation to certain demise, with the rise of fascism making the most of this doomed fate via confronting contradictions such as fixed capital expenses and militant labor with the only rational solution, forced labor and liquidation. This bleak reality makes it no surprise why cynical, existential, and nihilistic forms of expression are so common, including the heavy metal movement, in which entire generations of youth, entitled to nothing but contradiction and threaten nuclear annihilation, seek any meaning whatsoever, even if that meaning is a realization of there being no meaning at all. This is not the only response one can have towards the contradictory and damned system of endless capital accumulation. As long as this system exists, there will remain the desire and necessity of an alternative, a system in which capital accumulation is abolished and the interests of the common man are prioritized. In essence, the idea of communism exists in relation to the doomed reality of capital, as expressed in Marx's quote on the specter of communism. The task of eliminating the ideology of communism is a fruitless one, given its inextricable relation to the inherent flaws of capital. However, because of this antagonistic relation, and the dreadful implications a more equal society would have on the ruling class of owners, capital will rationally preserve its interests, especially ideologically, as we have seen before, during, and after the Cold War. Anti-communism is as much a core Western ideal as freedom and democracy, which is precisely why in the capitalist universe of dialogue, these subjects are presented as opposites. If capital is freedom, and freedom is life, communism is anti-life. No questioning of freedom is made when the free press is owned by massive corporations and serves the owner's interests in every field of media, nor when the Free Press Foundation is founded by CEOs, chairmen, and vice presidents. Freedom isn't in question when democratically elected socialist politicians in South America are assassinated by CIA-trained operatives, and fascist dictators are thrust into their place. Freedom isn't in question when books are burned, and parties are banned, and whistleblowers are silenced, and the marginalized are victim blamed, and the future of this planet's existence pushed towards inevitable extinction. The capitalist universe of dialogue predetermines communism as anti-life, and capitalism the freedom for life. No further elaboration is required to justify the treatment of those in favor of anti-life, for they threaten life itself. The form of said anti-life is irrelevant, whether it be the pot-smoking anti-war protest, the demonic Soviets, a fed-up exploited laborer, or the gutter-dwelling child begging for just a few more crumbs. There can be no compromise with atheistic communism. No halfway in the preservation of freedom and religion. It must be all or nothing. No more half measures. I refer you to these resources for an in-depth history of the USSR and pre-revolutionary Russia in general, but here's an extremely brief rundown of the USSR from foundation to collapse for anyone that only has a United States middle school history education. The USSR was a workers' state created by the mass action of the Russian working class under the leadership of the Bolshevik Party. The workers' state suppressed capitalism and protected nationalized property relations. The USSR was isolated by imperialism, however, and cut off from the world market. As a result, the leadership of the workers' state degenerated, workers' democracy was suppressed, and the economy degenerated under bureaucratic control. The bureaucracy exercised a reactionary influence within the workers' movement internationally, but the state nevertheless represented an opposite to imperialism and protected a number of deformed worker states and national liberation movements against imperialism. As the economy declined, an illicit capitalist economy grew up in the USSR. As the power of the USSR declined, its influence in world affairs declined, facilitating the overthrow of the deformed worker state and the marginalization of communist parties in the West, and a loss of influence in the Third World. As the authority of the central power declined, a rising counter-revolution grew up. The state hit back at this counter-revolution, but proved to be impotent. Through the person of Boris Yeltsin, the counter-revolution triumphed. The multinational state disintegrated and the planned economy was dismembered. With the demise of the workers' state, the bureaucracy was disempowered and its political influence was eclipsed. The demise of the workers' state opened the way to the bourgeois taking political power. A genuine workers' state emerged in the fires of immediate hostility to a world materially motivated to strangle it at birth. It is commonplace to hear of the unimaginable violence and carnage the Russian Revolution entailed, but less so an acknowledgement that the oppression, exploitation, and humiliation of an endless mass of peasants at the hands of a small aristocratic elite, which considered itself a stranger to its own people, who were degraded to a different and inferior race, was the harbinger of a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. This hostile world necessitated a vigorous defense to avoid a premature death at the hands of counter-revolution and capital, and as a result, set the groundwork for authoritarian measures commonly referred to as Stalinist. The implementation of a one-party system, the suppression of political dissidents and forces of counter-revolution, and various anti-democratic measures such as the limiting of Western influence, including Western music, bred suspicion and distrust amongst the populace and those genuinely working towards socialism, especially when the leadership itself harbored similar distrust and paranoia towards a populace perpetually at risk of infiltration by Western imperialist forces seeking to stoke counter-revolution. There is no one more critical of the failures of the Soviet state, specifically its deepening gap between party and people, worker and bureaucracy, than the revolutionary socialists. In fact, the Russian Revolution itself was the ideological laboratory in which those seeking a more just world confronted firsthand the very real challenges and contradictions we'd like to imagine only take place in theory books. Questions of equality and equalization, the universal asceticism of egalitarianism, and the particularities of historical circumstance, the dogmatic stand against the state, and the dogmatic preservation of the state. Trials and tribulations worthy of an era containing 3 civil wars and a time of troubles. Concerning the USSR, the new ruling group is called upon to carry out this work, not in an empty and aseptic space in which the economic and political compatibilities, the relations of force, the contradictions and conflicts that inevitably emerge make their presence and their weight felt. Any new society is stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it comes. The Bolshevik regime could not revert to its democratic origin because it could not hope for enough democratic support to guarantee its survival. Additionally, the Socialist German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, warrants due criticism in its alienation of the state from its own people, the people it claimed to serve the interests of. Referring to the GDR, political structures were rigid. There was top-down, hierarchical decision-making and an often claustrophobic, patronizing attitude. There was a paranoid fear of opposition and subversion, which soured relationships between the people and the ruling party. However, what the GDR did achieve is the encouragement and development of a social conscience among the people, the idea of placing the good of society at the center of social activities, not individualism, as well as the elaboration of clear social goals to which the majority can subscribe. Society was organized on a socially just basis. People were guaranteed stability, a secure job and housing, access to healthcare, culture, and education. Individuals felt that they were socially useful and valued, and this gave many people a satisfying justification for their lives. The USSR's mere presence of a more egalitarian society is what caused Western countries to adopt the welfare state. And once the socialist countries ceased to exist, we saw the 180, suddenly having no more need to satisfy its populations with concessions of better living conditions because there were no alternatives. Narrowing our focus a bit here, the Soviet leadership and socialist countries in general, to the contrary of the myth of gray and dreary communist dogma, placed great emphasis on culture and the arts, particularly music and theater. The Soviet Union made concerted efforts to revitalize cultural activity in a war-torn Germany. The GDR boasted some of the world's most renowned composers and artists, recognized even by the West. However, art forms deemed containing subversive, capitalist, or Western imperialist potential were monitored and subjected to censorship, particularly in the early days, jazz and rock and roll, typically viewed as debaucherous Western filth. It cannot be forgotten that contemporary Western culture had its own conservative disapproval of jazz and rock and roll, contradicting its limitless and hedonistic free market that encouraged the pursuance of such cultural satisfaction, typically off the backs of its demonized, marginalized populations. American and Western culture had many decades and centuries of technological development necessary for new musical instruments, such as the electric guitar, to be cultivated, something the comparatively backwards Russian and Eastern European workers did not have the privilege of obtaining easy access to. Additionally, this material and cultural difference has implications on the sensibilities of the populace, in Russia's case being relatively historically conservative. Lenin himself recognized this technological gap and encouraged the prioritization of rapid technological advancement. It can be argued it is this very technological impetus that bred the ideological infiltration so feared by the ruling party of the USSR, an ironic contradiction running parallel to the tensions inherent in American conservative ideology, as an unrestricted free market bred the very excess social conservatives sought to contain. The 60s and 70s saw similar bitter conservative reactions to evolving rock and emerging heavy metal movements throughout the Western world, despite becoming increasingly popular amongst the youth. Similarly, in the Eastern Bloc, a conservative and paranoid reaction remained within the dominant party's leadership, with the majority of Western music being shared in underground circuits. However, starting in the late 50s, the Soviet leadership introduced a strategy of de-Stalinization, referred to as a cultural thaw of sorts, and allowed radio play of Western bands, as well as organized events such as the Moscow Youth Festival to include Western rock bands. Despite laws restricting the access to Western music, a burgeoning tape culture emerged amongst the populace, taking advantage of state-sponsored tape recorders and a gradual relaxation of restrictive enforcement. Ideologically invasive Western literature such as Orwell's 1984 required a grasp of English and fortunate connections. Western music only required a pair of ears. The arguably natural human pursuance of the forbidden and a mythologized forbidding culture led to further fascination with rock and roll and heavy metal by Soviet youth. Tone-deaf reactions by the Soviet leadership only exacerbated this deepening gulf between people and party. De-Stalinization efforts allowed further expression of social discontent, including via music with social groups such as the Bards of Discontent. Party-sponsored vocal instrument ensembles provided Western instruments and equipment to underground musicians, in exchange for a say in the lyrical content produced, which understandably frustrated artists further. The state bribed underground artists with Western equipment to stop producing Western-influenced music. Social discontent was interpreted by the West as discontent with the idea of socialism. Despite Soviet political and youth groups for decades expressing frustration with austerity measures, gradual market reforms, patronizing government responses, and a sense of abandonment by a party leadership more interested in chastising its working populace than actively listening and advocating for them, as a party for workers should do. Politically charged lyrics often included critiques of obtuse party leadership, but eventually, as in the GDR, resulted in a heavy metal youth culture that was more distant and disinterested in these related affairs. Soviet leadership under the complacent Brezhnev and baffling Gorbachev administrations responded with capitulations to this Western ideological framework and continued to abandon its own hypocritically proclaimed socialist ideals with gradual privatization and mystification of forbidden Western media. The workers, faced with deteriorating socioeconomic conditions and incessant mirages of Western utopia, combined with pervasive American anti-communist global imperialism, constant threats of nuclear annihilation, and unresponsiveness from an impersonal government, understandably harbored hopeless, cynical, and escapist sentiments, including the hurricane of fresh air offered by an exciting and mystified heavy metal. The GDR, canonized as having the utmost draconian security measures, originally faced similar populist ingratiations to rock and roll and heavy metal with similar suspicion and paranoia. The Stasi started observing the scene closely in the early 80s, and we even have their statistics, observations, and arguments concerning heavy metal. Extreme groups, such as heavy metal fans, skinheads, punks, and grufties, were thought to have a seditious character. To justify further surveillance, a fascist connection was created, highlighting SS-like runes in names like AC/DC, Kiss, and Slayer, and the band's partly military looks. Though the stigmatization as neo-fascists slowly reduced, the Stasi kept believing that the heavy metal fans would remain a danger, based on sociological studies and the insight that interests in music could change and the boundaries between youth cultures were not necessarily closed. They declared heavy metal fans as the punks or skinheads of the future. In fact, heavy metal fans in the GDR were mostly apolitical, often integrated in everyday life, for example, at work, in factories, and so on. Being a metal fan was mostly limited to leisure time. The Stasi slowly recognized that and started to downgrade heavy metal fans as simple sympathizers of a fashion trend, or, in the view of the Stasi, less threatening as simply music fans, as the file from 1989 shows. Their main interest is heavy metal music. That's why they go to concerts or dance events as a group. Heavy metal fans with partly neo-fascist tendencies are just single phenomena. Through this destigmatization, several socialist youth organizations and journals began openly discussing the subject of heavy metal and its social implications, utilizing sociological and musicological studies highlighting that any musical genre stands at the nexus of musical form, social organization, and cultural identity. In one such socialist article on the subject, our researcher states, heavy metal's success in West Germany is based on its compensatory function for the West German youth. It offers a way to deal with the circumstances of capitalism, youth unemployment, a lack of apprenticeship positions, fear of the future. Another researcher detects a similar ability of metal to process negative consequences of capitalism and modernity. To end the article in a positive manner, he quotes the West German band The Scorpions. We understand our music as a message, as a positive message. We have something to say with our songs. One of our LPs is called Crossfire. Basically, it's the old story. Destroy the cannons, give peace a chance. By defining heavy metal as an escape from capitalism, not as a result of it, the authors suggest an applicability of heavy metal in socialist countries. In an interview in 1987, a GDR official spoke up for respect and tolerance concerning heavy metal. He emphasized that there has been a boom in music in the GDR, and that heavy metal would be a current magic formula of popular music. He pushed the integration of heavy metal with arguments that allowed the inclusion of the music into socialist life and culture. Indeed, he emphasized positive aspects and its relevance for socialist education. Heavy metal is vital, bodily activating, has a compensatory function, and is therefore an eligible part of the socialist music culture. He even highly values the artistic perfection, especially when it comes to speed metal. That expression of an inclusion of heavy metal by an official, not just a journalist, was very important. As previously mentioned, understanding music as the nexus of musical form, social organization, and cultural identity, and thusly understanding the aforementioned desperate social conditions of the 1980s, we come to understand heavy metal as not music that creates undesirable ideas and behaviors, but a reflection of undesirable social conditions. An East German female metal fan in 1988 wrote to a youth radio station saying, "I found my way into heavy metal because of a group of boys who influenced me a lot. Before that relationship, heavy metal was for me only chaos, meaninglessness, madness, listened by misfits, drunkards, and freaks. By chance, I got to know some of them more personally. I noticed that many boys have problems with their parents, with girls, in the school, at work. Almost all of them can't deal with our society. They're sick of all the empty words and phrases about planned realization, as you can often read in the newspapers. Most of them are working and know what it looks like in reality. They try to suppress or drown all these problems in alcohol. That's why these boys are often so aggressive. A sign of devaluation by fans of other music styles turns often into heavy bashing. Prejudices against other music fans should rather be diffused. One likes interesting lyrics, the other the aspects of dancing. Another is captivated by the incredible sound of an e-guitar. One should not demote other youth because of their different opinions about music and call oneself out the only pure. If only looked at through the lens of Western propaganda, it's easy to reduce this discussion to a matter of an oppressed communist regime, envious of American freedom, commonly manifesting in the beleaguered population, desperate for a taste of democratic exports in the form of American heavy metal. What this reductive perception ignores is the analysis of music as a result of social conditions, and therefore ignores the development of American heavy metal as a result of undesirable American social conditions. The 80s saw Ronald Reagan confront a lost American dream of the 50s, the civil rights and anti-war movements of the 60s, and an economic crumbling of the 70s with a vision for America, one that included a spiritual commitment to traditional American values. The American dream was to be revitalized by way of an unencumbered free market, entrepreneurialism, and pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. Coinciding with this inspirational visage was a declaration of war on the social ills tearing the country apart. Moochers, Satanists, communists, welfare queens, druggies, and the like. Reagan and Bush tirelessly preached of America as the shining city on a hill, in comparison to the aggressive impulses of an evil empire such as the USSR. No arsenal or weapon in the world is so formidable as the will and moral courage of free men and women. America's traditional values and philosophy of government makes the most distinctive mark of all to a tired and disillusioned world. American media and culture was inundated with representations of this supreme American way of life. The prosperous nuclear family in sitcoms, free market capitalism glorified in Hollywood movies, excess, opulence, and consumption equated with freedom. And the only way to get there was by buying what Reagan and Bush were selling, through a total buying in by the ruling class of powerful and influential business elites, and a middle class being catered to after the failures of 70s liberalism. A large portion of the working class had no choice but to buy into this utopic, providential, prosperous America, and despite being blamed for society's ills and further victimized by conservative policy, became increasingly conservative. Despite the red, white, and blue colored glasses being stared into throughout the 80s, and a new age of prosperity and profits for the wealthy elites enjoying record tax cuts, the working people saw destitution, rampant homelessness and unemployment, ridiculous military expenditures, threats of nuclear annihilation, the gutting of public programs and services, while having the blame being placed squarely on the least fortunate. Right-wing pundits and figureheads chronicled rampant violent crime and child rapist stories with title consistency, the accused perpetrators, of course, being the most marginalized populations: racial minorities, homosexuals and drag queens, the homeless, drug addicts, convicted felons, and heavy metal Satanists. While the white, middle, and working class youth that made up the majority of heavy metal fans in the late 70s and early 80s were not on the absolute bottom of the victim-blaming hierarchy, their class position and societal proximity to the bastion of the white suburb, in tandem with a musical genre vilified by traditional conservatives since its inception, led to a unique breed of conservative reaction taking form in the Satanic Panic, and famously, the Parents Music Resource Center. Formed in 1985, the PMRC's self-proclaimed mission was to educate and inform parents about an alarming new trend towards lyrics that are sexually explicit. In addition to a rating system for musical content, similar in nature to the one used in the film industry, and parental advisory labels on album covers, The PMRC also lobbied to have certain songs banned from radio airplay. These actions, they argued, would help parents raise morally responsible children by limiting their exposure to profane, sexually explicit, violent, and occult messages. While the PMRC singled out certain artists and particular songs, the cultural form of heavy metal quickly became their primary target. Thus, heavy metal stood at the center of the controversy that erupted. Despite veiling itself under the guise of political neutrality, with word choices such as resource center, the PMRC was anything but. In fact, it served a profound and obvious role in the conditioning of America into a conservative, shining city on a hill. Famously started by political wife Tipper Gore, who was utterly shocked at Prince's Purple Rain. She joined forces with other political wives to start the Resource Center, less famously with the help of donors such as Nancy Reagan, Beach Boys vocalist and outspoken conservative Mike Love, and small fry Joseph Coors. Yes, that Coors. He donated big time to Reagan's 1980 presidential bid, helped create the conservative Brain Trust Heritage Foundation, and was infamous for his anti-union labor practices and discriminatory policies towards minorities, women, and gays. But Tipper Gore was a Democrat. Additionally, despite veiling itself under the guise of protecting children from sexually explicit lyrics, the scope of conservative censorship included lyrical themes of profanity, violence, suicide, homosexuality, drugs and alcohol, and occultism. It wasn't just limited to obscene lyricism either, including the content of music videos, album covers, and content performances. When questioned about the PMRC's rating for Sheena Easton's Sugar Walls, Susan Baker told a reporter, "You should hear the way she sings those lyrics, using this very sexy, erotic voice." Baker was less concerned with what Easton was singing, but rather how she was singing it. As their battle gained momentum, the PMRC's assault on rock and roll went far beyond the lyrics. It became a full-blown attack on rock and roll as a cultural form, with heavy metal as their primary target. Despite having early troubles with individual record companies, PMRC ally and president of the National Association of Broadcasters, Edward Fritz, bolstered their authoritative legitimacy through his vast record industry connections, and advised they go straight to the head of the Recording Industry Association of America, demanding action to be taken and broadening the scope of their campaign to national coverage. Originally unmoved by yet another moral panic concerning new music, record executives were helpless against the surge of media coverage and national attention the PMRC gave rise to with their lofty, moralistic, conservative crusade, benefiting from powerful political connections and taking advantage of a core tenet in 80's Reaganite ideology: protecting children from satanic child abusers. After the economic necessity for both mothers and fathers to work to provide for children eroded the traditional nuclear family-defining gender roles so proudly touted by conservatives to solve moral degradation, more and more parents relied on childcare services outside the home, causing more and more fear and paranoia about what will potentially happen to these children, now that the nuclear family cannot defend them. Additionally, significantly increased divorce rates exacerbated this dynamic, leaving many Americans intimately familiar with yet another capitalist society contradiction. If the boom and bust cycles of capitalism and societal hardship therein require the destruction of the nuclear family, but the nuclear family under capitalism is the only thing preserving our prosperous and moral way of life, how can we expect to live in a prosperous and moral society? Conservative media coverage stoked the reactionary flames of these serious topics by reducing the cause of hardship to morally bankrupt individuals of society, not the societal structure itself. Instead of confronting real politico-economic issues, we must focus on the dangerous individuals lurking in the shadows, ready to take advantage of these tough times, namely child abusers. The McMartin preschool child abuse saga in 1982 is a key example of this moral panic regarding the perceived lack of safety children were acutely suffering. Local reporters broke a story of how hundreds of accounts of alleged sexual molestation occurred at this particular preschool, followed by a concerned mother accusing a teacher, Raymond Buckley, of sodomizing her son. Despite being released due to lack of evidence, the police continued the investigation. Instead of asking parents to question their child about teachers at school, the police specifically listed various graphic sexual acts, in addition to including the teacher's name, and stoked an already burning moral panic even further. Hundreds of parents and children reported a variety of accusations, including observing a ritual in a candlelit church where figures in dark robes slaughtered animals and forced him and several other children to drink the animal's blood. A group of classmates were taken on an airplane ride into a house where Ray Buckley was wearing a witch costume. Underground tunnels that lead to off-site locations where other adults who did not work at the preschool participated in similar rituals and acts of sexual abuse. FBI behavioral scientist Kenneth Lanning estimated that in the 5 years following the start of the McMartin investigation, he personally investigated approximately 100 cases of ritual abuse, all of which involved preschool-aged children who described satanic rituals involving candles, robed adults, chanting, blood, feces, and sometimes human dismemberment, without any physical evidence or other substantiating proof to corroborate their stories. Lanning also noted that these types of reports were virtually unheard of before the McMartin case exploded in 1983. The McMartin case and a number of similar cases elevated the perception of Satanism as a dangerous, child-abusing mega-cult, previously limited to the most fringe fundamentalist religious groups. This revitalized satanic panic rediscovered an old nemesis, rock and roll, and now in the 80s, heavy metal, of which was rife with satanic, evil, and occult imagery. Televangelists such as Billy Graham, the Peters Brothers, and Pat Robeson sponsored seminars, picket lines, and record burnings to profess the evil influence of heavy metal, participating in the reactionary frenzy supposedly aimed at protecting children. Judas Priest and Black Sabbath albums were some of the most frequently burned records at these rallies, much to the chagrin of a vintage record collector. These massive displays of conservative morality garnered massive attention from the media, which prompted many to be outraged by this very outrage, mainly the youth themselves who were fans of heavy metal, horror, and video games, believed to glorify such satanic immorality. Before you know it, one letter read, the moral majority will be dragging rock and rollers out of their homes and throwing them into the fires along with their records. The PMRC's championing of causes such as protecting children only served to rekindle an old reactionary flame that ran away from the root causes of real societal problems in favor of out-group targeting and vilification for made-up problems. Senatorial hearings saw the PMRC shift the blame from any critical analysis of extremity in music to simply a variety of explicit and graphic heavy metal album covers and lyrics. They repeatedly misinterpreted metal songs, provided anecdotal evidence of sexual abuse and murder by metal fans, showcased irrelevant statistics related to suicide, linked the Son of Sam to Black Sabbath, Ricky Casso to Black Sabbath and Judas Priest, and Ricky Ramirez to AC/DC. The focus of the senatorial hearings was not on popular music found questionable, it was squarely on the cultural form of heavy metal. The conservative American conclusion was that heavy metal was music that creates undesirable ideas and behaviors, not a reflection of undesirable social conditions. Frank Zappa made it abundantly clear at the hearings his position of opposition to all the PMRC stood for, as well as Dee Snider of Twisted Sister, both being brought to the hearings in aims to portray metal fans as dumb and vapid, but displayed the opposite. Additionally, John Denver was brought as a suspected ally, but succinctly pointed out the flaws in scapegoating heavy metal instead of addressing root cause societal concerns. One of the most interesting things about the music that young people are listening to is it gives us as adults a very clear insight as to what is going on in their minds. We can know what they are thinking by listening to the music that they surround themselves with, the people I have had the opportunity to talk with, the troubled children, the teenagers who are considering suicide. What they express to me is a real frustration in their lives, an inability to communicate with their parents, an inability to understand or to envision any kind of a possible future because of the nuclear threat that we live under. They do not see things getting better economically. They do not see things getting better for the small businessman, for the small farmer. They do not see a future for themselves. It is my opinion that it is out of this that some young people put a gun into their mouths and pull the trigger. The PMRC had a pervasive impact on how society viewed young metalheads, often treating them as freaks, had an impact on legislative politics, emboldening many conservative and fundamentalist officials to double down on metal bashing. However, the PMRC had no clear plan of action, only offering an ambiguous threat of legal action. They viewed this as a consumer issue, requiring the market to develop solutions, what one senator referred to as free enterprise volunteerism. In fact, the hyper-discussion of heavy metal served to bolster the youth's support of it. Remember, the PMRC was a brainchild of conservatives in the fold with Reagan and Bush, at this time rapidly pursuing deregulatory policies in every industry, including music. In framing their argument as a consumer issue, the PMRC highlighted the role of free market capitalism in encouraging and proliferating the excesses that characterized 80s metal. The fact that the recording industry remained largely unregulated allowed violence, drugs, sadomasochism, and Satanism into the marketplace. The hedonistic opulence of free market capitalism contradicted the conservative reaction to it, a conservative reaction that is dogmatically attached to the idea of free market capitalism and anti-communism. What is the function of this contradiction, other than to allow unabated capital accumulation while outsourcing the blame of its manufactured problems onto vilified outgroups? How could such a subversive product exist and end up serving the very system it supposedly subverts? Throughout the Cold War, the US intentionally paraded its culture of freedom and prosperity onto the dreary USSR, boasting unrivaled consumer privilege and freedom of expression. As previously discussed, heavy metal was one such privilege coveted by an Eastern youth barred from its splendors. And what exemplified the splendors of the free market better than hair metal? The last part of this video, and this part as well, heavily utilized the dissertation Nothin But a Good Time, Hair Metal, Conservatism, and the End of the Cold War in the 1980s by Chelsea Ann Watts. I recommend it if interested in a more exhaustive analysis of the subject. In it, Watts highlights how a closer examination of hair metal as a cultural form reveals a conservative subtext looming beneath the genre's transgressive facade. The 80s under the Reagan administration sought to usher in a new era of the American dream, valuing the capitalistic free market and entrepreneurship, though outwardly appearing transgressive as discussed in the last section, and despite cultivating an image of hedonistic drug addicts and womanizers, there's no better example of striving for capitalistic ideals and entrepreneurship, albeit in an alternative fashion, than the hair metal of the 80s. When questioned about Poison's success, lead singer Bret Michaels told an interviewer, "When many other bands were home watching TV, we were rehearsing. You've got to remember that rock and roll is a business, and if you start screwing up business-wise, you're going to fail. It's the only occupation where business and pleasure are the same. It's easy to confuse them." Any number of hair metal musicians recount tales of hardship, battling for slots at shows, performing relentlessly, marketing themselves tirelessly, following their dreams and pulling themselves up by the bootstraps. Countless bands lived in poverty and destitution, doing whatever it took to make it big, get found, or be somebody. This served to inspire countless fans in attempting to make it big themselves, something all too familiar in today's entrepreneurial music industry. A Def Leppard fan wrote to Hit Parader in 1985, saying, "I'm a struggling vocalist who can't seem to get a break. Instead of being able to spend time with my band, I'm wasting time working so I can buy gas for my car and keep a roof over my head. Is the only way you can be a successful rock performer is to be rich before you begin?" In the age of the internet, the dynamic is quite different, but the fundamental desire is the same. Life sucks. How can I make it big to live in luxury like my favorite artists? Hair metal bands in the 80s played on the Sunset Strip hoping to get found by an agent. Today, you hope your TikTok goes viral. Little is said of the countless failed musicians who didn't make it, or the managers and corporate executives parasitically benefiting massively from the groundwork being done, or the reasons as to why normal life was so undesirable and unfulfilling. But every working class kid knew of the rags to riches possibility. The American dream was there for anyone who just worked hard enough, or perhaps got lucky enough. The American dream is freedom, and freedom is money. And money requires hard work and luck. Another exemplar of hair metal's capitalistic nature is the massive impetus on marketing, advertising, and business in general, as Bret Michaels said. MTV made the splendors of hair metal success visible to everyone, especially when music videos moved from onstage performances to theatrical mini-films. These scenes offered powerful affirmations of the prosperity, success, and freedom hair metal provided, only if you work hard enough. Poison's Nothin' But a Good Time starts off with a young man slaving away washing dishes. His noticeable unhappiness is exacerbated by an older, overbearing manager who clearly represents traditional ideas about hard work, that enters the scene and condescendingly states, "Hey, I'm paying you to wash dishes, not to listen to rock and roll," as he flips off the radio and returns to the dining room. The dishwasher returns the radio back on just in time to hear the DJ say, "For all you slaving on the job, here's some poison to get you thinking about those good times." The young man looks like he's gonna give the manager a piece of his mind, and when he kicks the door to the dining room open, he finds himself transported to a Poison concert. He has, in essence, escaped his mundane existence and traded it in for a life where people do get paid to listen to and perform music. I'd rather get rich at playing music than get rich doing plumbing. I don't want to work until I'm 60 and die poor at 70. These responses point to the attitude many working-class adolescents had about the futility of the career choices ahead of them, and suggests that the traditional notions of hard work yielding prosperity simply didn't apply to them. Thus, they were forced to find another way, an alternate means of achieving the same end goal. Warren, inspired by previous examples of fulfilling this alternate American dream, pursued the tried and true path of marketing themselves and playing gigs on the Sunset Strip, and eventually got signed to Columbia Records. In 1989, the same year that Spin reported heavy metal was the largest revenue-grossing musical genre in the world, Warren released their debut album, Dirty Rotten Filthy Stinkin' Rich. The album's title and the related songs and music videos overtly proclaim hair metal as a prosperous and successful endeavor, exemplified by Warren's own seemingly instantaneous success. The album cover featured a caricatured fat, greedy businessman who sprouted $100 bills where his hair should be. During the video for Big Talk, this figure, who identifies himself as Cashley Guido Buxley, captures and tortures the Warren band members to extract the secrets of their success. One of the gauges on the torture machine, which spikes to maximum every time a Warren member is tested, measures attitude. At first, Buxley reacts with shock to the band's rowdy onstage performance, which includes spraying the crowd with alcohol. However, by the video's halfway point, Buxley is bobbing his head to the music while puffing on his $100 bill cigar. At the end of the video, Buxley rips Janie Lane out of the machine and says, "Give me some of that! I want some of that!" The character, Cashley Guido Buxley, functions as a symbolic representation of corporate America. The fact that he is trying to extract the secret to wealth and prosperity from Warren provides a powerful testament to how successful and profitable hair metal had become. Though the exchange in this video plays out in a cartoonish and exaggerated form, it was, in many ways, a reflection of the rise of hair metal and the commodification of subversion. Though the outward signifiers of success were different for hair metal musicians, they participated in its conspicuous consumption just like their counterparts on Wall Street. Though on the surface it appeared markedly different from conservative visions of the American dream, hair metal had the same end goal in mind: to become dirty, rotten, filthy, stinking rich. What is the commodification of subversion? As Herbert Marcuse stated in One-Dimensional Man, capitalism's novel feature is the flattening out of the antagonism between culture and social reality through the obliteration of the oppositional, alien, and transcendent elements in the higher culture, by virtue of which it constituted another dimension of reality. The higher culture, or another dimension, refers to artistic alienation, or the conscious transcendence of our currently alienated existence, namely the alienation we have as workers from capital. Art was a way for the repressed and taboo truths of reality to be revealed separate from the particularities of the administered real world of business. The theater play or poem or song offered a glimpse into the faults and contradictions of society, as well as a glimpse into what we truly desire or dream of. These antagonistic elements of art remained alienated from business due to their oppositional nature, their repressed substance, their truth. The decisive distinction between dimensions is not a psychological one, between art created in joy and art created in sorrow, between sanity and neurosis, but that between the artistic and social reality, the great refusal, the protest against that which is. What has changed in the contemporary period is the difference between the two orders and their truths. The absorbent power of society depletes the artistic dimension by assimilating its antagonistic contents. In the realm of culture, the new totalitarianism manifests itself precisely in a harmonizing pluralism, where the most contradictory works and truths peacefully coexist in indifference. Now, this gap between the arts and the order of the day is progressively closed by the advancing society, and with its closing, the great refusal is in turn refused. The other dimension is absorbed into the prevailing state of affairs. Thus, they become commercials. They sell, comfort, or excite. The fact that the transcending truths of the arts, the aesthetics of life and thought, were accessible only to the few wealthy and educated was the fault of a repressive society. The cultural privileges express the injustice of freedom, the contradiction between ideology and reality, the separation of intellectual from material productivity. The tabooed truths could survive in abstract integrity, remote from the society which suppressed them. Now, this remoteness has been removed, and with it, the transgression and the indictment. The artistic alienation has become as functional as the architecture of the new theaters and concert halls in which it is performed. The desire for the youth in the 80s to rebel against the conservative status quo found an attractive avenue for rebellion in the commodity of hair metal. Its absorbed subversive qualities weren't anything new from the old contradictions present in free market capitalism. It was just a new flavor, a shiny new commodity for sale that was bought up by a particular generation of consumers seeking their own way to adhere to the profit-making status quo. It just so happened to consist of teased-up hair and electric guitars. Capitalism seamlessly occupies the horizons of the unthinkable. What we are dealing with now is not the incorporation of materials that previously seemed to possess subversive potentials, but instead, they are pre-corporation, the preemptive formatting and shaping of desires, aspirations, and hopes by capitalist culture. Witness, for instance, the establishment of settled alternative or independent cultural zones, which endlessly repeat older gestures of rebellion and contestation as if for the first time. Alternative doesn't designate something outside mainstream culture, rather, they are styles within the mainstream. It is in this way we see hair metal, known for its extravagance and debauchery, or attitude, flattened out into merely another skin or aesthetic to pursue the only remaining dimension left, business. Even the most debaucherous and hedonistic path towards this end is absorbed into this peacefully coexistent indifference. A hair metal frontman and a Wall Street wolf are both acceptable aesthetics to adopt in the pursuit of profits, regardless of drug-addled delinquency or misogynistic behavior, because of their profit-making capacity. In fact, rebelliousness and debauchery are the primary commodities offered by hair metal. The rebelliousness of heavy metal, historically rooted in the underground, a forgotten legacy of class consciousness and marginalization, was quickly reduced to its base shock value and attractive aesthetic. Bands like Motley Crue took a lot of the underground metal imagery such as Satanism and combined it with the more popular glam rock marketability. Hair metal was famously at odds with the more serious and extreme metal bands of the 80s, especially the American thrash scene and European metal bands, who were less enamored with glitz and glamour and typically a bit more conscious of their societal position. These bands discussed more poignant, extreme, or existential subject matter, but that did not stop many from partaking in lowbrow, sleazy, and generally similar subject matter to many glam bands. Likewise, despite criticizing hair bands for selling out or going soft, and having some awareness of societal problems such as war, oppression, and nuclear devastation, many bands were comprised of similar young, white men just seeking a rebellious path or an escape. Not only did hair metal rake in the profits by selling its perceived subversion as a commodity, but it did so in an American values enforcing manner. The promotion of conspicuous consumption in the form of fast cars and expensive fashion, the non-stop peddling of the American dream, and perhaps least understood, the rampant misogyny and enforcement of the patriarchal status quo. Additionally, European and British metal bands, originally averse to the American decadence on display, eventually developed glam styles of their own, such as Def Leppard, convinced by the massive American consumer market. It's easy to take a look at any number of 80s hair metal bands and consider them subversive of traditional gender norms, but, in actuality, we see in hair metal a display of the crisis points in the meaning of manhood in the 80s and throughout America's history, in which men worked to resolve tensions between the real, lived experience of being a man and the ideal singular masculinity against which all men measured themselves. Hair metal, with its unique blending of androgyny and misogyny, was one of the many socially constructed masculinities that emerged in the 1980s as both a response to and a reflection of these tensions. We're not ashamed of little hairspray and makeup. We've always said it takes a real man to wear makeup. The hair metal aesthetic appropriated elements from two gendered arenas: feminized glam rock costuming, which included bright colors, loud patterns, sequins, and makeup, and the seemingly ultra-masculine leather and studs wardrobe of heavy metal. This aesthetic, referred to by Watts as biker culture with a feminine aesthetic from the neck up, also called glam grotesque, drew heavily from traditional heavy metal sources, the macabre, gothic, and gritty, and combined them with aspects of femininity in ways that were at once ominous, threatening, and theatrical. In fact, there were many varieties and combinations, such as a street style, more horror-based, and even ultra-feminine aesthetics, which all seemed, at least on the surface, to be challenging naturalized constructions of gender, much like their glam rock predecessors. However, the challenge to gender norms ended there. Hair metal musicians gradually closed the gap between on and off stage personas, eventually arriving at an insistence in the authenticity of their androgynous, gendered identities, which they overtly proclaimed as hyper-masculine. As the look became more popular, bands decided to stay in character, taking pride in authenticity. Why separate everyday life from the music? I look this way and I play this way. Bret Michaels on stage is just the same as Bret Michaels off stage. As far as the clothes go, they're just our way of expressing ourselves. Sure, we get looks and we get comments, but if I didn't want them, I wouldn't dress this way. As previously discussed, hair metal was this generation's readily identifiable aesthetic of rebellion, but not against masculinity itself. As a genre dominated almost exclusively by male performers, who created music for male consumers, hair metal expressed and subsequently sought to ameliorate anxieties about masculinity and masculine power. Though the civil rights movement and gay liberation posed significant threats to notions of hegemonic masculinity as white and heterosexual, feminism was the largest and most immediate threat because it issued a broad challenge to the notion of patriarchal authority that transcended race, class, and sexual orientation. Young men coming of age in the 1980s were forced to grapple with these failures without adequate traditional avenues for regaining a sense of masculine power. Though Vietnam had proven disastrous, for many adults, active combat duty remained a fundamental aspect of masculine identity, one that young men in the 80s had decreased interest in and limited access to. Rather than mobilizing young men for combat, in the 80s, America engaged in a nuclear standoff that only furthered feelings of helplessness and inadequacy amongst the adolescents. The faltering economy in the late 70s and early 80s also left many young men questioning both their desire and ability to fulfill traditional male roles of husband, father, and breadwinner. This was especially true for working class men, who suffered disproportionate economic hardship during long periods of stagflation in the late 70s and early 80s, with the threat of feminism looming large and limited access to political and economic means of asserting masculinity. Young men in the 80s found the stakes for reasserting masculine positions of power in popular culture were much higher than they had been in the past. Hair metal appealed to the same young men who were transitioning into adulthood, desperately searching for alternative ways to demonstrate their masculinity. Rather than carrying guns into combat zones, hair metal musicians entered rowdy arenas armed with six-stringed axes, poised to kick some ass. This historical and sociological understanding of metal culture is applicable, albeit slightly different, for the thrash metal movement and aforementioned polarization amongst metalheads, some seeking the extravagance and debauchery of hair metal, while others, typically even more alienated and marginalized, went for a dirtier, heavier style. It's easy to look in retrospect at the popularity of thrash and more extreme metal bands, but we forget its contemporary existence as a fringe, extreme subculture, especially in comparison to the massively popular hair metal, of which took considerable musical influence from the grimier underground, something heavier metal fans despised, perhaps somewhere deep down grasping with the powers of pre-corporation and commoditization of subversion, but that potentially liberating nerd shit was discouraged when they were homos to shit on. Though the hair metal aesthetic undeniably played with the gendered categories of male and female in ways that seemed transgressive and rebellious, hair metal embraced very traditional ideas about gender, in particular masculinity. Rather than employing androgyny as a means of queering the gender binary, hair metal musicians paired their gender bending with performances of hyper-masculinity, which often took the form of aggression and misogyny that ultimately reaffirmed the performer's masculine status and the power that status confirmed. Aggression and violence were key elements of hair metal masculinity. Manhood regained under Presidents Reagan and Bush was the compulsive masculinity of the schoolyard bully, a defensive and restive manhood, of men who needed to demonstrate their masculinity at every opportunity. Oddly, the more feminine I got visually, twisted as their frontman D. Snyder wrote in his memoir, the more aggressive and hostile I got as a person. Corky Gunn, lead singer of the ultra-feminine hair metal band Sweet Pain, explained, "We had to be tough because we dressed in women's clothing. We would get drunk and high and want to fight with anyone." For Gunn, and many other hair metal musicians, acting tough and getting into fights resolved questions of gender identity raised by the band's cross-dressing. In other words, it proved that they were real men. It didn't matter how much makeup we wore or the wardrobe choices you made. All that mattered was what was in between your legs. This hyper-masculine aggression and violence was coupled with misogyny, particularly via sexually obscene lyrics and in the treatment of female fans, who were almost universally reduced to groupies. "Our tour bus is like a pirate ship. It's where we rape and pillage," Rat frontman Stephen Piercy explained. "I want to make sure our female fans know how to behave." Skid Row frontman Sebastian Bach explained, "We come into towns, I tried. We come into towns, make friends, get welcomed with open arms, and hopefully, open legs." By casting all female fans as groupies, hair metal musicians added gendered dimensions to the power dynamics already at work in the rock star-fan relationship, which allowed male musicians to reaffirm masculine dominance and power, often at the expense of female fans. Watts aptly concludes that the cultural form of heavy metal offered a new masculine aesthetic that merged the surface elements of female beauty with masculine posturings that were either aggressive and dominating or hyper-masculine and misogynistic. Hair metal blatantly disregarded the visual signifiers of older traditional notions of masculinity, which gave these bands, and the entire cultural form more generally, a reputation as being both transgressive and subversive. However, a close examination of the genre, the music, videos, musicians, and fan culture, reveals that hair metal was simply a new means of asserting traditional ideas about gender, that men are dominant and powerful, and that women are subordinate and limited to roles that reduce them to sexual objects. Thus, Hair metal might look fundamentally anti-conservative. However, underneath the veil of eyeliner, aquanet, and spandex, hair metal worked to reinscribe traditional and fundamentally conservative ideas about gender. Despite the misconception that Metallica finally busted down the Iron Curtain in 1991 and brought Western culture to painfully isolated Soviet youth, in 1989, the USSR, as part of Gorbachev's perestroika policies, hosted the Moscow Music Peace Festival, a supposed international celebration of cultural reciprocity. In reality, it was yet another American-dominated event, headlining a motley crew of American exceptionalists that took the form of transgressive 80s hair metal bands, including Skid Row, Cinderella, Bon Jovi, and others. Cultural reciprocity was yet another campaign of thinly veiled, unilateral delivery of Western ideals, something Gorbachev seemed to become quite the expert at organizing and habitually encouraged throughout the final days of the USSR. Much like how hair metal was an invaluable American cultural export that spread throughout the rest of Europe, the Eastern Bloc, with its hated ideology and culture that needed to be rid of, was its ultimate recipient. Hair metal was branded as hedonistic and frivolous, an expression of unadulterated overindulgence that appeared to have little overt political meaning beyond youthful, transgressive rebellion. Additionally, at least on the surface, hair metal seemed to have very little to do with conservative ideology of Reaganized America. And yet, it was precisely these perceptions of hair metal that made it an ideal vehicle for public diplomacy in the USSR. The globalized resurgence of heavy metal throughout the 80s positioned American hair metal as an instrument of cultural imperialism. Gorbachev's capitulation to the West and baffling policy decisions served to disorient a populace already baffled and disoriented by decades of illicit market reforms, ineffectual leadership, relentless American cultural imperialism, and threats of nuclear annihilation. The hypocrisy and contradictions of said American culture forced upon the rest of the world doesn't matter when your own government commits cultural suicide. What happened to the Eastern Bloc afterwards is a repressed tragedy. Economic collapse, mass human rights violations, extreme privatized exploitation, a people abandoned because the desired goal was achieved. Freedom. Freedom from communism. Freedom from the ideology of anti-life. Freedom is life. And freedom is capitalism. What became of metal after the world became unipolar? In many ways, metal resembled the American ideology, finally victorious in its global battle of supremacy and hegemony, culminating in hair metal taking over the world with the fall of the wall in 1989, and even more American metal bands like Metallica rising to the pinnacle of musicdom in 1991, embracing contradiction, conformity, and blatant profit-seeking over the course of the following decades. However, metal also resembled the dashed hopes of many marginalized groups, accepting its fate of subjugation by turning to within, embracing its underground legacy, delving further and further into its inherent possibilities at the cost of extreme alienation, the likes of which aren't replicable in many other subcultures. Metal continues to conform to the status quo in many ways, but violently disregards hegemony in many others. Metal still serves as a tool for patriarchy and Western chauvinism to thrive, but also empowers the most marginalized to resist that very same oppression. It's a reflection of the intense contradictions faced by a world held hostage by capital, existing as a means of capital accumulation and as a means of capital annihilation. It's capable of achieving the highest levels of status and wealth, as well as the lowest levels of demonization and ostracization. In some ways, we can interpret the fall of communism in Europe as when metal truly confronted its position in reality, as something destined for worldwide acclaim and popularity, as well as an infernal and internal force, forever doomed to go more and more insane. The effects of the commodification of subversion are so deeply ingrained in our subconscious that we don't know where it begins or ends. We consider metal inherently subversive, and simultaneously inherently supreme and dominant. As Mark Fisher said, nothing runs better on MTV than a protest against MTV. Our every move is a cliche scripted in advance, that even realizing that is a cliche. Even success means failure, since to succeed would only mean that you were the new meat on which the system could feed.